Welcome to this meeting of the Family Services Select Committee. I'm Councillor Hamish Adurian. I'm the Vice Chair of the Select Committee, and I will be chairing tonight's meeting in place of Councillor Janet Evans, the Committee Chair, who is unfortunately feeling a little bit unwell and is passing on her apologies, wishing her a speedy recovery. This is the first meeting, I believe, of the Family Services Select Committee here in the Town Hall since the regulations that permitted remote council and committee meetings to be held by local authorities expired earlier this year on the 6th of May. So everyone participating must be present in person. The event is, as always, being streamed live on YouTube, and members of the public and media are welcome to watch the meeting remotely and listen to all the discussions taking place this evening. And of course, I would first of all like to welcome everyone, both here in the Council chamber and anybody listening live as well on YouTube. As always in the Family Services meeting and most other Council meetings, I believe it would be appropriate for us to start with 72-second silence to remember those who lost their lives in the Grenfell tragedy. Also at this time, I'm sure I speak for the whole Council in expressing our sincere condolences to every member of our community here in Kensington and Chelsea who have lost loved ones, relatives, family members, neighbours, colleagues, of course, to this COVID-19 pandemic that we have all been going through. And also our thoughts are with the victims, if I may say, of the families of the victims of last week's fatal car accident in Notting Hill. It's important to mention that as well. Before we proceed with the meeting, I would ask members of the committee to only switch on their microphones when they are speaking and turn them off when they are finished, as always. Please remain seated this evening, not necessary to stand up. If there have been any questions submitted by members of the public who are present, I'm not sure we have any this evening, but if any members of the public do join us, they will be invited to come forward to a microphone near the top bench. Okay, apologies for absence. We have apologies from the Chair, from Councillor Evans. We have apologies from Councillor Freeman, from the co-opted member Richard Derricky. I believe we also have apologies. Did we have another one? From Kathleen Williams as well. Do any members present have any interests to declare? Okay, thank you. We also have the minutes of the 21st of April meeting been circulated. Does the committee agree to sign them off as a correct record?
Mr. Vice Chairman, I have a correction, if I may, at your leave. Under item A8 of the previous minutes, in the second paragraph, the second sentence. It says he had contacted the contractor Mace. I would just like to make for the public record that wasn't me, that was actually Councillor Taylor Smith that did that. I just thought that I may as well flag that as a correction.
Okay, so it is Councillor Taylor Smith who had contacted the contractor Mace. Okay, we'll make that amendment before I sign them off. Thank you very much, Councillor Rendell. Okay, on to the first main item of the agenda this evening, which is our Special Educational and Disability Needs SEND review. And present this evening we have Julie Ely, who's the Assistant Director, Special Educational Needs, and we also have our educational, and we have Steve Cumber present. Steve, welcome to you as well. And I'm not sure I have your correct job title here, but you are Head of Local Offer and Outreach, perfect, XXSEN Outreach. And you're both present this evening to present us the Refresh Send strategy of the Council, and importantly to invite comments from the committee on the draft strategy, which will cover the period 2021 to 24. So this is an important opportunity for the committee to really give our input into the draft strategy before it is formally adopted by Councillor Rendell as part of his key decision. And also a warm welcome to Sue Redmond. Hello, Sue. She's chair of Full of Life, which is a parent-managed organisation providing support and services to families with SEND children in RBKC. In addition, we have Natasha Patton. Hello. And she is the designated clinical officer for SEND North West London CCG, NHS North West London CCG. And they are both joining us this evening to provide their view external to the Council of the SEND service. So thank you to all of you. And may I ask Steve and Julie to present. Thank you.
Thank you. Can I begin? What I'd like to do is just to explain that the Council's statutory duties and responsibilities towards children and young people with special educational needs and disabilities are set out in the Children and Families Act of 2014. And the very first section of the Act that deals with special educational needs enshrines the rights of parents and carers in a way that had not been done before on the statute books. And what that section does is it sets out their right to have a say in the way that decisions are made and services are planned, and an entitlement to have support and information that allows them to be full participants. And so we talk about co-production and the way that we develop our services, and this is fundamental to the way that we work. And it's not just that it's our statutory duty, it's the right thing to do and the right way to work, but I think the fact that it has the full weight of law shows how important it is that we work really hard to get that co-production right. Now, in 2015, central government was concerned to hear from parents and carers across the country about the way that those statutory reforms were being rolled out, about implementation, about the pace and the quality with which those changes were being made. And so they introduced an inspection framework which would be jointly led by Ofsted and CQC in terms of responsibilities for the health components of it. So there is a national programme of inspection to see how well local areas are delivering on those reforms. So it's not just the council's commitment and its delivery, it's about the way that we all work as partners to improve the outcomes for our most vulnerable children, those with the greatest difficulty learning and those with disabilities. So we are anticipating the phone call every Monday morning from the inspectors, because we are yet to be inspected. And as part of our inspection preparation, we've produced a self-evaluation, a SEF, and that document helps us to hold a mirror up to ourselves. And Steve's going to talk a little bit about our current SEF, and our strategy works on the things that we've identified as our strengths and our areas for improvement, and make sure that we take ourselves forward. And it's a 3-year strategy. So there's a lot to be achieved, a lot of change, but we are also building on the things that have gone really well up to this point. So I'm going to hand over to Steve now. Thank you.
Thank you, Julie. So it's a 3-year strategy, the strategy that we've produced, and it's significant in that it will take us to 2024, which is 10 years since the legislation that Julie mentioned came in. So it's a significant milestone since the legislation came in. Prior to the meeting, we provided a pack which outlines the processes that we followed to gather information from a wide range of stakeholders to inform the draft strategy refresh. We also provided a copy of the final draft of the strategy refresh and a link to our recently published call to arms self-evaluation. We hope that the members of the committee found this information helpful. Our SEND strategy is an extremely important document as it outlines the local area approach to meeting our statutory duties to meet the needs of children and young people with SEND, to ensure that they achieve success in their early years, at school and in further education, so that they feel valued and supported and can lead happy and fulfilling lives. Most importantly, our SEND strategy outlines how we will do this through the delivery of services and support that is based on the feedback of our local families that use them. As part of our commitment to co-producing our services, which Julie mentioned, we ensure that we also capture the views of children and young people with SEND. And we just wanted to take an opportunity to provide a couple of examples of this. For instance, we supported children and young people through our dedicated officer for young people's participation for young people with SEND to produce mood boards during the pandemic. This was to tell us about their visions for the future, which helped to inform the SEND strategy refresh. As well as producing things such as mood boards, which help young people to articulate their voice, we ask young people directly. For instance, asking Pfizer here, who was a supported internship and also joined the RBKC Youth Council. And if you don't mind, we've got a quick clip of part of that interview.
Hello, my name is Pfizer and I'm a supported intern.
What is a supported internship program?
So the supported internship program is 1 year and it's run by the academic term time, and it is a 5-day program which is 4 days in placement and 1 day in college, and you also do 3 work rotations.
How did you get involved in the Youth Council?
I got involved by the Youth Council by meeting with the leader of the Youth Council and filling out application form.
And what work have you been involved in the Youth Council?
The work that I've been involved in the Youth Council is the Grenfell Assembly.
How has COVID affected you, and how did you adapt to working from home?
So COVID never actually affected me, and the way how I adapted to work I adapted online really quickly, as I have this experience because I did previous meetings online before.
What are the next steps for you?
So the next step is I'm going to be starting an inclusive apprenticeship in the next few days.
That's just an excerpt of an interview that was taken to our CFA board for senior leaders to review when we actually focused on children and young people's participation as a whole. The third example I just wanted to give was where children and young people provide feedback on the services they receive and even help us promote them. So this is an animation that was put together for our travel training offer, and we've kind of cut it into 2 halves, so you get the first bit and then the second bit.
I used to go to school on the council's transport bus, but I'm going to college next year, so I wanted to learn how I could use public transport on my own. My teacher told me about independent travel training run by the council in our area, so I went and looked on the council's website. I spoke to my mum about it, and she was very dear and signed me up. They invite us to a meeting so that we can meet them and learn more about the training. They explained everything to us and gave us time to ask questions. My mum was a bit worried as I never travelled on my own before. I was given my own travel planner who showed me how to get on the bus and tube safely. I now feel far more confident about getting about by myself. I can't wait to start college, and I even go out with my friends now at the weekend. Travel planning has changed my life.
It's always a pleasure to hear those final words where she says travel training has changed her life and is promoting it to her peers as a great opportunity for them. So that's talking a little bit about the work that we've done with children and young people in the work that we do, as well as families. I also wanted to mention, as Julie said, our self-evaluation, our SEF. So as well as the SEND strategy, we have our self-evaluation. Our SEF provides a platform for us to continually improve. It is our opportunity, as Julie said, to hold up a mirror to ourselves, to recognise the areas that are working well, but also be clear about the things we need to work together on to improve. For instance, some key areas that work well include our clear local governance structure, which holds officers to account on the delivery of SEND support. Our work to develop school places to meet a range of needs through capital projects, which includes Kensington Queens Mill, a new special school in RBKC which opened this term. And the reshaping of our short breaks offer to meet the needs of local families. And this was particularly during the pandemic and the way they had to reshape their offer to meet needs. And some selected areas for development. So we know there's a need to reduce local waiting times for the diagnosis of autism. Continuing to develop and enhance our offer of emotional wellbeing and mental health support for children and young people with SEND. And improving the process and experience of transition to adult services. So they're just a few examples. So the strategy refresh and the SEF are jointly owned by the local authority, the clinical commissioning group, and our local parent carer forum, Full of Life, who play a key role in both challenging us, but also ensuring that our SEF is reflective of the lived experience of families in the borough. And you'll hear from Sue in a second for more on that. You will have seen from the pack that we have a strong joint governance process which enables senior leaders from all of these groups to oversee and have influence on the work that we're doing and our performance across our local area. And also hold us to account on the delivery of the action plan which is embedded in the strategy refresh draft that you've got. I'm going to hand over now to our designated clinical officer, Natasha Patton, who will outline some of the context regarding health provision for children and young people with SEND.
So the North West London CCG, which was formed in April this year, is focused on taking the NHS long-term plan forward, but allows us to address the system challenges that we face locally at a North West London level as well. And that includes mental health and children and young people. And that work feeds into the ICP at a local level. So if we move to the next slide, the Bi-Borough Integrated Care Partnership was formed in February this year, and we have 3 priorities for children and young people, which are to support children and young people to achieve good mental health and resilience, to enhance the whole system support for children and young people with speech, language and communication needs, and to ensure there's appropriate and timely support for neurodiverse children and young people and their families. These priorities are taken forward in multi-agency task and finish groups which report into the governance structures which we've outlined. I just want to highlight 2 of the foundations of the Children and Family Act which Julie has already referenced, and one of those is around joint working between the CCG and the local authority, which I really believe is key to improving the outcomes for the children and young people that we are working with. And secondly, co-production. And I just feel it's really important to emphasize the strength of this as a real key strength in our boroughs. And my role as DCO is made so much easier by those strong relationships. In a way, my role is to champion the Children and Families Act. And I can say from personal experience of working in other boroughs, as well as liaising with colleagues locally and nationally, that this genuinely is a strength in our area. Those strong relationships are both strategic and operational. The CCG jointly chairs the SEND Executive Partnership Board as well as the Joint Commissioning Board. And then the CCG has fed into the SEND Autism and Emotional Wellbeing and Mental Health strategies, and that links into the work that is underway in the ICP priorities. Operationally, we have many examples of good joint working Health participate in audits to improve the quality of our education, health and care plans, and SEN and social care join our meetings for the Dynamic Support Register, which monitor support for children and young people with learning disabilities and autism and challenging behaviour who are at risk of admission to hospital or residential breakdown. So that's really a whirlwind stop in health. There are some more slides in the pack around health if you wanted to some more information. But at this point, I'm going to hand over to Sue Redmond, our Chair of Full of Life.
Hello, everybody. My name is Sue Redmond. I'm Joint Chair of Full of Life. We are a parent support group that has been founded in 1994 and have grown basically to meet the needs of families across the borough. We now have approximately 750 families on our database and basically support them from when that child is diagnosed right the way through into adulthood. We work together. We challenge, which is also kind of a weird place for me to be here right now, because usually, you know, we'll be working, but also the guys will know that if something isn't right on the front line, we won't be backwards and coming forwards and telling them that. And that's the only way we can learn from each other, really. We can have all the strategies and policies you like, but if children are not having their needs met on the front line, then those pieces of paper are of no worth. We work together. We've developed different sorts of, coming back to what you were saying about, say, speech and language therapy services, where actually some parents have thought you needed a speech and language therapist right beside a child all the time. Well, in actual fact, if there's a total communication approach and the staff understand that are working with that child, understand their needs, then everybody can be involved in that, including the families. And the reason why I think that that works is because I know coming out the other side into adult services, when we set up our own services for young people, we didn't have speech and language therapy input, but our staff understood what needed to be done. And we've gotten on and done it, what we needed to do, but knowing that actually in the end we've somebody that we can come back to for reference. So I know that this is a good model and I know it's new, but actually over time this is going to work. And I think looking at, I suppose, how we would work in terms of families, it's not just, Full of Life trustees are all parents of disabled children. Some happen to be adults now with learning disabilities. We have a parent reference group that actually will cover the span of disability, so it's not just one particular type of disability. And that parent reference group then meets with the officers, meets together, and whatever we find, we then report into the Children and Families Executive Group. We also basically put anything that we're working on out to our database via newsletter, via email, so that everybody has an opportunity to come along and say what they want to say. And of course our direct services with the Independent Advice and Support Service, which basically from when a child is diagnosed, and we're very lucky I suppose because of the reputation we have, both clinicians in St Mary's and Chelsea Westminster refer families to us on their diagnostic letter, if you like, so that they know that the families are going to get that long-term support. I think we will challenge because, as we've said so many times to people, the children are not negotiable. But we'll also work together because that's in the best interests of the families and the children. And I think we've done well. I think we've shaped things in a way that, you know, I think will stand the test of time. I think when you look at the 10 years that we've been looking at this as a piece of work, I was just saying to someone the other day, we now have in the borough a special needs school for children with autism. We have, I think it's 4 units attached to mainstream primary schools. We'll soon have 2 units for children with autism attached to secondary schools. And then we've got the short break St Quintin's, which basically Full of Life were instrumental in starting that off with Councillor Ritchie, sadly, who's no longer with us, and that, you know, that is there and stands the test of time now, probably for 2 generations of children at this point in time. And I think when you look at this Act coming in, as an organisation, we were already developing or delivering family support. What was the Parent Partnership Service at the time is now the Information Advice and Support Service, and Carers Advocacy Service, which we developed, where we saw local gaps in provision for our parents who will be, which people don't think, and even as a mother of a 29-year-old with drug-resistant epilepsy and a really good right hook, I didn't realise that this was going to be for life. And I think this is something that actually needs to be acknowledged by everybody that's involved in this work with SEND, is that you have a child with special educational needs for a life. Those needs may change and morph, but you will be caring for that child for the rest of its life or your life. And I don't know, I'm getting emotional now. My street cred's going out the window. I think that needs to be looked at in terms of carers' support going forward. We provide, I've left a pack with Councillor Randall, all sorts of stuff via the organisation. And I think it's really important that we're here to push and challenge and to be there to support people at times when they're feeling fragile and vulnerable. And we've stood the test of time, really, as an organisation and worked with these guys. And I think that's, have I missed out anything? The only thing, and I'm going to stay quite calm about this, really, I hope, is to do with transitions into adult services. That's where there are major issues. We have a service for young people with complex needs that need one-to-one and two-to-one support. My daughter is one of them. Going forward, our families have been, I would say, completely ignored in terms of ongoing service development. We have all of this early intervention, we have all of this great work, and then when they become adults, and I'm talking about whether it's 18 or 25 or 26 or 27, we're not really taken into account, I don't think, properly. So when I keel over and die, do I think locally we have enough to be able to care for my daughter right now? No, I don't. So I think, although this is children and families, I think we need to look at this big time. My daughter has lived here, like most of the children and young people, all of her life. She doesn't know any other community. So why shouldn't she have housing here? Why shouldn't she live locally with children, or young people, I should say, or adults? She's always going to be my child. But you know, that actually she knows this patch. This is her community. So why should she be moved anywhere else? So that's something I think that's obviously on the agenda for work going forward. It's something as an organisation we're not going to let go of. But it's also something to look back and see what has actually happened locally, and acknowledge in a way what was here before the Children and Families Act, but also what we've been able to embed and keep solid no matter what. Through COVID, we continue to run our services for families. It happened to be remote. We went to lockdown for the services for young people twice, but basically have been open probably most of the time once we got our systems in place. And we run our parent forums online, so the training and the get-together still happens, and I think I've covered everything. I'll stop now. Have I covered?
Natasha and Steve as well. And Sue, thank you in particular. I'm sure you're all very pleased with all the work your organisation has done and continues to do as well. Thank you for sharing all that with us this evening. I think a lot of the things that you mentioned in particular in transitions, I think it demonstrates how a lot of the issues that we consider cross over between different committees, different parts of the council, and we should do our best to consider them as well as we can. So I will now open questions to colleagues, and if I may, I'll start with one small one before opening it up to colleagues. I think a lot of the things that are mentioned in the draft strategy are excellent, and the ambition is fantastic. My question, I'm not sure who is best placed to answer it, maybe Councillor Rento, is really about budgets and how confident are we that over the next 3 years we will be able to meet a lot of the ambitions that are set out in that draft strategy. And I guess the second half of the question possibly is, to what extent are the things set out in there on a statutory basis, and what element of the ambitions in there are actually non-statutory? So it's a question of two halves really, and what our feeling is on the budgets about that.
Thank you, Vice Chairman. Yes, as you may know, the committee may know and the council may know, in terms of budgets as a whole, it's going to be a difficult few years ahead for us, but that does, of course, not mean that we can't commit to the statutory services we need to provide. And of course, SEND provision and everything, we fully support, and I think and I wholeheartedly welcome the strategy, and of course, we welcome the committee's views as well, as you mentioned earlier, Vice Chairman, in terms of the KDR that will be taken in due course. In terms of specifics of the budget, I'm going to hand over to probably Ian, if I may, who's our Borough Director of Education, who'll be able to answer that. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Renler. I think that's a really important question because the funding is complex. I want to be really upfront with the Select Committee. So in terms of the provision that Julie's team oversees for children with education, health and care plans, the funding is provided through the dedicated schools grants and through the high needs block of that grant. Now, it's worth saying to you that, as with many local authorities, our dedicated schools grant is overspent. We are in deficit. We monitor that regularly through our work at Schools Forum, and the primary driver for that overspend is our high needs block. Now, absolutely in line with your question, we want to make sure that where children, young people, adults have had a statutory assessment, and it's agreed they should receive top-up funding at their school, at their college, that should continue, and that's very much part of a national discussion that's been underway to talk about the rising costs of the demand, and making sure that local authorities are appropriately funded, frankly, to meet that demand. And as Julie has mentioned, that there is a government review, an SEND review. We're awaiting that review to be published and the outcomes there, because there are particular implications for the dedicated schools grants. In addition, where young people have an education, health and care plan and they are eligible for travel assistance, then there is a council budget, a general fund budget that funds transport, and again that budget is also under increasing pressure, but again where there's a statutory identified need to meet that provision, we continue to do so. But I do want to assure the committees our levels of spend are monitored regularly, and we continually look at ways in which we can invest, as Sue has said, in our local offer, so that actually children, young people, young adults are able to be educated and trained, hopefully move on to jobs locally, and so where they are eligible for travel assistance, actually those journeys are shorter because they're being educated locally, or in some cases they may be moving on to independent travel training as well. I hope that's helpful.
Thank you, Ian. Just a brief follow-up, really. Just take an example, I suppose. So the short breaks offer, is that something that's a statutory service that we have to provide? So where would the funding be coming from on that? Or is that something that we as a council are offering, and so where is the funding from that?
So the funding for our short breaks provision, again, it comes from the council's general fund. Okay. I think it's worth saying that some of those young people will have been assessed with some social work input, and will have access provision either at St Quintin's or elsewhere. But we also have put in place an assessment process, which is, for some families, would prefer it to be a little bit lighter touch, and what it's meant is that more families are able to access support, perhaps when their children are very young or at an earlier stage. But what we're trying to do is maintain a very flexible short breaks offer, that there's also the opportunity for parents to have a personal budget as well, so that they can enable care flexibly in their own home, as well as attending some of our mainstream provision and St Quintin's. But again, we're seeing rising demand for that service, but the parents' feedback, and Sue may have a view, is that actually it's a service that a lot of parents know a lot about and feel hopefully confident to approach us at an early stage for support and advice, and for after school, weekend and holiday provision.
Okay, so what we're taking away then is that despite budget pressures which are being acknowledged, the council is still committing to deliver all of these services. Okay. Colleagues who would like to... Councillor Schmetterling.
Thank you. I really just have a short question, but before that, could I just request everybody to actually speak into their microphones? I had difficulty, maybe it's the wax in my ear, which I do have, hearing one or two of the people enough. The question I was very interested in the video that you showed, the travel training and all that, and the children who spoke. I was just curious how old they are, 16 or how old, especially the last one who spoke.
So, for the travel training, Julie, do you know the age of the young person who spoke on the travel training?
Yes, she's about to be 16. She will have actually started college this term.
Oh, yeah, because she was on the way to college, yeah.
Was it always the same child speaking, or what about the other ones? How old were they? Do you know roughly? Before that, where you couldn't actually see the face, but you could see...
Pfizer.
So
Pfizer, yeah.
Pfizer would have been 19 or 20, so she had gone on to do what's called a supported internship, which is a one-year course getting young people ready for the world of employment. So she just finished that programme and was going on to an inclusive apprenticeship, which is kind of the next stage. So the internship, you do 3 placements in a year, real work placements, 4 days a week, and a college course as it is a college course. So you do learning on the 5th day of the week. You do that for a year, and the whole aim is to support you to overcome the barriers to finding employment.
May I just ask one more thing about that? How independent can these young people do this? I mean, if they go to college, whether it's the younger one at 16 or the older one, how independent are they? Are there special arrangements made for them by the colleges, or are they just part of the normal cohort?
So most of the young people who've got the significantly greater difficulty learning will go to college with an education, health and care plan that specifies the nature of their barriers to learning and the help that they would need. So the college might provide a communication support worker, they might provide some extra opportunities for literacy, they might provide communication groups. So the sorts of help that they needed when they were in secondary school continues, because their development of their independence is going to take them longer than it will other young people of the same age. And we continue that support, and every year we review it. So there might be, so the young lady Lucia who was talking on the independent travel training video, she would be travelling completely independently because the trainer will have assessed that she's now competent to do that, but she may have some help with her studies when she arrives at college because she needs support with the complex content of her course.
Thanks, but the students they mix with are not necessarily those with SEND, so it's a mixed class, but they just get special assistance.
We have a full breadth of offer. Some of them will go into mainstream class, the universal offer of everybody in college in a subject that they like and have support. Some of them will go to developmentally based courses where all of the young people that are in the group will have a similar level of difficulty. So it's a very careful matching process of deciding where the young person is, what they want to do, what their future aspirations and hopes are, and the stepping stones that we need to put in place to get them there.
Thank you, Chairman. First, a sort of comment. Thank everyone for their presentations, and I think particularly Sue Redmond. I found that extremely interesting. And I think the issue of the transition is one that I know Cass Addenbrook is particularly interested in, and it falls between the 2 committees, which I'm afraid doesn't make us look very good. And I think we really have to find a way of dealing with it. Maybe a special one-off meeting of both committees or something, I don't know. My questions were, firstly, how many children, if any, does the council place in residential schools?
Very small numbers, less than a dozen.
That's very good, yes, because I mean sometimes where a child has very challenging behaviour, there's pressure from a parent to do that, and I mean there is obviously such provision is expensive. Thank you. I mean, I think my sort of comment, and I'm afraid it's a slight criticism of the report, is that we have a long list of sort of aims, which is in the, kicking off, I think, on page 62, and these are all very laudable, but none of them seem to very few seem to be numerical, seem to be measurable targets. It's a sort of direction of travel. And I mean, Sue mentioned, no, so I apologise, it wasn't Sue, it was Councillor Rendell, I think, who mentioned something that's not where there's room for improvement, which is the delay in getting diagnosis for autism. I mean, that's just the sort of thing where there ought to be a numerical target which could then be measured. I mean, that's how I know that this is an NHS matter, and that's how the NHS works. They set targets, both externally imposed by government and internally one set by the trusts, because I'm on the governing body of CNWL, so I know how this works. So I would consider, I urge you to consider putting in some numerical targets. And leading on from that, rather, as suggest Chairman, a lot of these, as I say, targets not as hard. I mean, they certainly have dates in them, which is good, but I mean, a lot of them seem to be September 22, so perhaps we should return to the topic in a year's time and see how we're getting on. But I'd like a comment on the numerical or lack of numbers to measure you by.
I'd like to reassure you that a lot of the areas that we, when you get down to the detail, we have got targets. So, for example, the number of education, health and care plans that we produce within 20 weeks, we have a target of 90% of them to be produced in time, and I can tell you that we've been achieving 100%. So the targets are there, but they're more as kind of individual team plan level, and what we've tried to do with the strategy is sort of just take it up to a slightly higher, broader level. But accompanying our SEF, we do have a data dashboard. So as well as the narrative that you've seen a few extracts from, there is quite a detailed, you would imagine that we've got targets around GCSE and A-level performance, and as you rightly say, Natasha probably knows the ASD wait time targets written on her heart. So they do exist. And perhaps we could share with this group after the meeting, we could send you the data dashboard so that you could see the kind of metrics that supports the narrative that you've been given.
That'd be helpful, thank you.
Other questions from committee? No?
Sorry,
Amanda.
if I just wanted to touch on the transition point again, which was obviously Ms. Redmond's, one of her principal concerns. And I just wondered, given that one of the ambitions of this SEND strategy is to strengthen pathways into adult world, which is a noble aspiration as it's put down, if one of the parent representatives doesn't find this comforting or not sufficient or doesn't go far enough, etc., I just wondered what parent input there had been in the development of the strategy.
We've been involved in the strategy, and we've been involved in... Can you hear me? Yeah?
Not very well. You're not coming through the mic.
Is that better? We've been involved in the strategy. We've been involved in the self-assessment framework work. The issue is, I suppose, when you're looking at the different levels of need as well, in terms of transitions, you're looking at some people, like the young people that spoke earlier, who will go into college and will do stuff, but they will come out of that college, and what's going to happen then? Then you're into adult services, which is a whole new world, as the Disney song says. And you know, there's some young people like my daughter who are have very complex needs, who will not get a volunteering job. But what are the opportunities to be able to be available to her as she grows older and we grow older? We've been involved in this for quite a while, and we've, you know, but it's really difficult in terms of what adult services will come to the table with to do, because these guys are building the evidence, we're building the evidence of need of young people that are residents of this borough for 18, 20, 25 years, and yet they're not coming to the table to develop services and support, as far as I can see, to continue that. And that's a real worry for me, and it's a real worry for other mums and dads too. You know, we have all of the policies, we know, you know, everyone knows the children's needs that are coming forward, but where are the actual service developments? As I said, we've done all of this stuff in 10 years, you know, with this special needs school and the units and all the rest of it, but adult services have developed no services since we started developing our own service at Full of Life, and that's 10 years ago. So it's really, to be quite honest with you, this pandemic that's kind of lifted the lid on that for me as a parent. We kind of knew it, but didn't really know it. And that's something that we need to look at. Adult services need to come to the table. Our children are residents of this borough and they need to live here. And they also need to be able to do, coming back to what Councillor Williams was saying about when you're looking at residential places, they're very few. But actually that's because of the services that are put in place and the scaffolding around those children's needs that are happening now. But when they hit 18 or 19 and they tend to be very tall and big and very strong, things change and it can get really messy. And then before you know it, the parents that are older, it's very different from being slapped by a 5 or a 6-year-old to being punched by an 18 or 19-year-old. It's a very different thing. And there's only so much that you can take when the scaffolding that has been around that child all its life suddenly is gone because adult services seem to think some kind of miracle cure has happened. It's just bizarre. And then it's, you know, as parents, you can then be put into the box of you haven't accepted that your child has grown up and are adults. But of course we do. We know full well they are. But we need services that we can trust to continue on the work that's happened from children and family services. My daughter benefited from the early intervention teams in the 90s, in the 2000s. She was excluded from her special school, out of school for 4 years, but the SEN team worked creatively with us, and then we got her back into school. But then when I saw what was ahead, we then decided we weren't going to have that, because when you look at all of the serious case reviews that come out from adult services, you've got death by indifference, 6 lives, 74 lives, Winterbourne View. I can go on and on and on and on in a place that actually animals wouldn't be treated the way our sons and daughters, not in this borough, thank God, but the way society views our children because they're different. When they get to a certain point, they're of no value. But what people forget is that we're all going to be like my daughter. We're all going to be forgetful. We're all going to be annoyed. We're all going to need someone to brush our teeth and clean us and shower us and want to do that and give us a laugh. We're all going to be that way, but people forget that. You think you're bulletproof when you're healthy, but you're not. And so as one of the wealthiest boroughs on the planet, I think, you know, we should be leading in care for adults with learning disabilities because all of the children that are coming through children's services now are going to grow up. And what's there? We have to be leading in it. So I'm sorry to be negative about this, but that's the reality. We need to look at it properly and build services.
Thank you, Sue. I wonder if I should offer Councillor Rendell and officers the opportunity to maybe comment a little bit on transitions, given it is a topic of interest this evening.
Yes, thank you, Vice Chairman, and I'd like to thank Sue for that very impassioned and from the heart speech. And I think that, you know, just having those real life examples really brings people into, you know, the conversation, you know, because you can put anything down on paper, but, you know, hearing that, you know, that emotional experience really brings it to home. I know we're following it up shortly, Chairman, but in A5, one of the political prime priorities for me leading this department is transition between between children and adults. For Councillor Kamali as well, is also a priority for him for adult social care, and I'm conscious that what we've heard tonight I think really brings home to that, and of course I think maybe that's up to you as a committee. Councillor Williams' suggestion of maybe scrutinising both of us all over that in due course may be a good idea just to really get to the bottom of this, but I would like to say that perhaps that transitions between children and adults could be significantly improved. I'm putting that on the record, and we really need to look at that. But I've been hearing about this since I became lead member about a year ago, and hence why it is on my priority, my 5 or 6 priorities for this year and into next year as well, in order to really get to bottom and tackle off, because it is an issue that needs looking at, it needs improving in order to have the best possible service that we can have in our RBKC for our children who are transitioning to adulthood.
Thank you, Councillor Rendell. Are there any other questions before we go on to the next item? If not, then thank you all very much. Thank you, Julie, Sue, Natasha and Steve as well for your time. Okay, moving on to item A5, which is the, as Councillor Rendell just referred to, the lead member for Family and Children's Services priorities for the years 21-22, and the lead member, we have invited him this evening to tell us a bit about his priorities for the year and to update the committee on Family and Children's Services developments. There is a report associated with this, which members have had the opportunity to examine, but Councillor Rendell, would you like to perhaps briefly outline some of the main elements you'd like to draw our attention to?
Yes, thank you, Vice Chairman. And before I get started, I would like to refer committee members to the report that is attached to item A5 as the appendix. I'd just like to say that the numbers and figures in here are provisional, so they're not final. Just if people got, the wrong impression or thought things were different as they are, I'd just like to say that in the Kensington Chelsea Children's Services report, they're just provisional numbers at the minute, and of course happy to update people with final numbers if and when they come, I should say. I won't touch base for very long on this. It's all in the report. It's only a one pager, but happy to take, of course, oral questions on this from the committee members. But as you'll be able to see, there is I've got some priorities in place to lead the department on and really kind of get on top of. And as people can see, it's all listed here. So one of the big ones, of course, are transitions, as Sue rightly referred to earlier on. Reduce serious youth violence, which is still a significant issue in this borough across all of London, of course. Not singling us out, but putting different ways and services we can in place in order to reduce that. Obviously. Hearing the voice of the child and young people, I think that's something that we could improve upon, and I've got lots of comments from that, from this committee previously in order to do that. So as you'd be able to see, I put that as a priority for this year as well. Of course, mental health recovery for COVID, I think is really important, and of course that runs in conjunction with Grenfell Emotional Support and Wellbeing, which I'm conscious we'll touch base on later as well. And another big thing I think we need to focus on is both following rural numbers in North Kensington, but also school inclusion as well. I'm conscious it's not listed there, but that's probably an error on my part, that school inclusion and exclusions are poor, quite frankly, in our RBKC, and we want to improve that significantly, and that obviously adds to better outcomes, especially around the serious youth violence angle as well. And of course, working closely with my colleague Councillor Folks on apprenticeships, people in NEET, and all these other skills that we've been offering, because as we may know, the pandemic has brought home there's lots of job opportunities, but also there's lots of unemployment as well. So how we can link those up together, especially with the younger people going forward. And then I'm not sure if you want me to move on to Afghan children, perhaps, but I'll leave that to you, Chairman, because we probably want to touch base on that in further detail.
I think it may be, given that it has been quite topical, I'm sure members and public listening in will be interested to understand a little bit more about the situation of Afghan refugees in the borough, and of course there's also the issue of unaccompanied asylum-seeking children as well. So if you could briefly update us, I think that would be
Sorry, excuse me, can I just interrupt? We at this end of the table are finding it very, very difficult to understand what you're saying. Would you mind slowing down when you speak? I beg your pardon.
That's fine. No, thank you. Thank you for pointing that out, Amanda. So on Afghan children and Afghan refugees, as you know, the government quite rightly welcomed Afghan refugees fleeing Kabul after the NATO withdrawal. So far, I think, as you know, the figures change every day. But so far, we have 800 Afghan refugees in RBKC staying in hotels. Of course, a significant number of those are children. Some of those, of course, will be unaccompanied asylum seeker children. As you'll see in the report, when this was published, we had 43 in the borough, which is above and beyond our recommended target. However, for the current Afghan refugee children, we're still assessing that with the Home Office through our own council officers, and we'll get a better picture of that in the coming days and weeks in order to what services we're able to provide those children. This is in addition to about the 500 other refugees from other countries that we are currently hosting in RBKC as well. So as you can see, there's quite a significant pressure on public services, on funding, but we're supporting them as much as we possibly can, and obviously finding out who requires what support as the weeks go on.
Thank you, Councillor Randall. Colleagues, questions? Councillor Schmetterling.
Thanks, Councillor Randall. I must admit, you were a bit too fast for me as well. We'll practice outside this meeting. But about the numbers of refugees, you mentioned non-Afghan refugees. Did you mention a number as to how many we are hosting?
I think Glenn can confirm, but it's about 500.
Also in hotels. So we have a total of 1,300 refugees at the moment in Kensington, in temporary accommodation.
Yes.
Somewhere.
Yes.
Okay.
Mostly in Earls Court and Camden Ward, Queensgate Ward.
Thanks.
Chairman. Yes, I mean, two things. Firstly, on the children in hotels. I mean, obviously the aim of the Home Office is to move them to permanent or more permanent accommodation, which is most cases will be elsewhere. But what can be done to help them with their education until that happens?
So I'll call Ian in a moment, but those children which are in the borough, we're finding locations for schools for primary age school children. Of course, which I mentioned earlier, we have a surplus of places for those. In terms of secondary school places, of course, pressure is much more acute, but we're working with those schools in our borough to provide above and beyond additional places for those students who from Afghanistan who do need to go to schools, secondary schools in Kensington and Chelsea. But I'll hand over to Ian, who will be able to provide more detail.
Thank you, Councillor Randall. So I think as the numbers have changed, numbers have increased, the discussions we were having with schools in the past couple of weeks, it's worth saying that we've got incredibly inclusive and welcoming schools who are really keen to help, and absolutely we'll be able to provide full-time education for some primary age children and also for some secondary age children, even though our secondary schools don't have spaces. We had a really helpful discussion with our secondary head teachers last week, and we're going to have a follow-up conversation at 8:15 tomorrow morning to talk exactly about the support that might go with those children as those schools go over numbers essentially to take the children. However, I don't think it will be possible to provide every single child with a full-time place, but it will be possible to provide some educational support, and that may take the form of some after-school classes a couple of times a week. It may take the form of some part-time nursery provision as well. So again, working with our schools, there are a variety of ways in which I think we can provide that educational support, whether it be through what I might call an educational package of support, or through a place in the local school.
Sorry, Chairman, yes. So thank you very much. I mean, it's very encouraging. And because obviously many of those children will speak little or no English at all. So that's really good. Different matter, serious youth violence. I thought that the numbers of youth who are engaged in this programme are quite small, but I wonder, is there anything more that the police could do to make this work better? In other words, the focus on my question is not on the council's response, but I mean, you are obviously working closely with the police. Are they, because I think some officers get really well engaged with the youth and do great work. Others find that more difficult.
Thank you, Councillor Williams. Yes, so myself, along with Councillor Will, who is lead member for community safety, and along with our officer colleagues in early help, have been working closely with the police in order to look at some of the causes, the challenges of serious youth violence, especially in all parts of the borough, in order to tackle that. Some of the challenge, of course, and I think COVID has produced more challenges. So we've got obviously more NEET children who have been excluded, which is what I referred to before, in order to try and tackle those numbers, in order to keep children in school, which, if they're out of school, of course, leads to other challenges. We've got our own detached outreach team, which works alongside with the police and other youth clubs. So, for example, I know Earls Court Youth Club works extremely closely with the DOT team, especially when they're going down to Southern Chelsea in order to, and parts of your ward, Councillor Williams, to ensure that children are safely off the streets and, you know, not getting into county lines or things like that. But I may hand over to Glenn, if I may, to provide a bit more colour on what we're doing specifically with those children who may be at risk of this.
I think it's worth the committee noting that community safety are just developing a refresh of the serious youth violence strategy, and it may be something that you may want to see in due course. Particularly, this is in its early stages of being developed at the moment, and at the heart of that is engaging with young people to ensure that we're addressing some of their priorities. But as Councillor Rendell has explained, we have a range of support services that are in place. That includes our youth offending team, obviously, but those are children that have been formally charged with an offence and require a specific service. We've had the development of the detached outreach team, which is far more early help orientated, working locally within the community, attempting to divert young people away from some of those pull factors in crime or into serious youth violence. So there is an array of services that are there. I think that there is strong, healthy partnerships with our police, but I think that the serious youth violence strategy will help harness that even further, and I think it would be really worthwhile you looking at that in due course.
Amanda?
Yeah, I have a couple of questions, just going back, if I may, Ian, to education of the refugee children. As we know, there are falling roles in primary schools, so we have multiple places available both in the north and the south, so I'm surprised we aren't able to place sufficient children in the primary sector. Question?
No, a really good question, Amanda, and happy to respond to that. It's a developing situation, and numbers have been rising. So in terms of the numbers that we had, or we were aware of, probably 10 days ago, it felt as if the 45 or so primary age children we were able to support through focused provision at 2 schools in the south, quite near to hotels at Marlborough Primary and St Cuthbert's, and because of the additional support that we think the children are likely to need around additional English language support, for instance, it felt perhaps a better approach talking to our head teachers to provide support around 2 or 3 schools rather than having a couple of children in each school who would require that additional support. But I think we'll want to keep that under review, because as you say, that there are some spare primary places, but we'll also need to think about the support, particularly through our early help team, that wraps around those children to make sure they can make the most of a full-time education place. And as I say, I'm hopeful that we can enable some part-time educational support through, for instance, after-school classes as well.
He's briefed to us at this. So assuming you then place the Afghan or other refugee children in those places with schools with specialist provision, one assumes then that the borough won't be favouring those schools in other casual admissions. So, for example, other schools will benefit from the increased number of children then into the borough. Would that be right? Or would it be still that they would fill until they're completely full, as it were?
I suppose it's worth saying that we do have an in-year admissions process which is ongoing, and we have some children who are on, some refugee children who were with us and waiting for a school place before the summer, for instance. And of course, now that schools are back and schools are fully open, there's been a chance to place some of those children who've been waiting for that in-year place now. So that's happening now for children who perhaps were waiting for a place at the end of the summer term. But we would continue to, where they would want a local place, and it's either nearby to the hotel or nearby to where they hope to be settled. And we do acknowledge that a number of the families will, of course, be resettled elsewhere, that we would want to provide them with full-time education. And where there are places and schools feel that the support is available to meet those needs, then yes, we would seek to do that. It's also worth saying that in terms of funding for the children, if they are able to be enrolled in schools before the census date this term on the 6th of October, it does mean that the money will follow through in the next financial year, which is also a key factor for our schools, and particularly, as you know, Amanda, from your role on Schools Forum, we absolutely want to make sure that schools are appropriately funded to educate the children that they have on their roll.
Thank you.
It is a common knowledge that we have some unaccompanied minors in the borough. Can you tell us what support is being given to them in housing, placement, before they even go to school? They have to have a proper place to go.
Yes, that's right. So all unaccompanied asylum seeker children are assessed. Obviously, we've got to ensure they don't have a parent around. We've also got to assess that they are indeed children. I think we had one case last year where a person professing to be a child was not a child. So we have to ensure that those children are children and can get them the proper services from that. But I'll hand over to Glenn, who will go into further detail about what specifically is offered.
Yes, for each child that's assessed to be an unaccompanied asylum-seeking child, it's a statutory duty that we ensure that those children become looked after by the local authority, and therefore, as a looked-after child, there's a whole range of services that are then provided to them. Obviously, accommodation and a person that can attend to their care needs is really important. But equally, so is an education placement, and all of our looked after children have education plans in place, and that their needs are reviewed through a statutory process by an independent person in order to ensure that their needs are being met, and those needs would be in an array of needs, including health, education and social care needs. Currently, we have 43 unaccompanied asylum-seeking children, but they tend to enter our care at approximately the age of 16, so they quickly populate into our care leaving population. So approximately 47% of our care leavers now are former unaccompanied asylum-seeking children. Our care leaving population is rising. We have approximately 161 at this given time, whilst we have a total number of looked after children of about 105, 106. So it changes on a daily basis, as you can imagine. In terms of the Afghan children, I think we have to distinguish those from the refugee families that were placed in a number of hotels prior to the current Afghan crisis. We have identified that in terms of the Afghan children, there's approximately around 326 under 18-year-olds placed in hotels, which are bridging placements. So we understand that the Home Office is going to relocate them in due process. So therefore, our wraparound needs in relation to those needs to be tailored to their specific needs that may only be for a short period of time before they're settled elsewhere. What we have done is undertaken some recent work where we've identified whether or not these children, these are the Afghan children, whether they have a legal guardian with them, living with them in the hotels. And originally we were being given anecdotal information that there was approximately 80 unaccompanied asylum-seeking children. That isn't bearing out in relation to the work that we've been doing with the families in the hotels. It would appear that they are with either parents, grandparents, aunts or uncles. There are some that we are wanting to assess in more detail because we need to determine whether or not they do have a legal guardian, but actually that's much smaller in number than we originally anticipated.
Thanks.
Thanks. This is interesting. I mean, it's a question really for Glenn Peach, I think. To follow on from what you were saying about the unaccompanied children in particular, whether from, well, mainly from Afghanistan, is, if I understood, well, two parts. One is, have I understood correctly that most of them are sort of older, like 16, 17, because you said they're going to join the leavers cohort. So that's the first part. The second part is, why are they unaccompanied? How do they get here unaccompanied if they're minors, especially? I mean, they didn't all swim across the channel. Or maybe they did. I mean, take a boat across the channel.
I tried to make the distinction between the Afghan families that have come just recently, where we've determined thus far that the vast majority of those children do not appear to be unaccompanied. The unaccompanied children that we are seeing are generally from refugees that are coming from across all places across the world. The main gateway has been through the various ports. And as you know, that Kent was particularly saturated as a region, and the Home Office dispersed some of those refugees in a number of local hotels. They were originally assessed, or a proportion of them were originally assessed as being young adults, only for when they arrived in Borough to present to us as children, and we then have a legal duty to assess them. And as Councillor Rendell made reference to, sometimes that may include undertaking an age assessment, which is a very complex process, can be subject to quite a high degree of challenge in a legal context, so we have to make sure that we follow due diligence and appropriate assessment protocol. So what we've experienced lately from the non-Afghan families, so the refugees that are in 8 of our local hotels, is that a significant proportion of those of young adults have presented to us where we've assessed them to be children. So therefore our unaccompanied asylum seeking numbers have actually grown quite rapidly since the Home Office has placed refugees within our local hotels.
Thanks. It's still, I mean, I've tried to read up about this, but there's still something which puzzles me. I mean, for these younger people, and especially those who perhaps claim to be sort of young adults on the way, but are assessed as children here, is how do they, what is it that has happened to them? Is it they've lost their parents in a war, or, you know, this is what I'm trying to understand, how they set off. I can imagine single people, or maybe even small families doing it, not going through official channels. But I still find it very difficult to understand how such young people get, never mind getting here, maybe France or somewhere else in Europe, but how they do it.
It's for a variety of reasons.
And why?
Actually. As you can imagine, there's no one narrative in relation to our unaccompanied asylum-seeking children. So it very much depends on what's happening in a country, in a region, as to why young people may leave their country and make their way to the UK. But we know that you would have heard on the news the route from France to the UK has become even more intensified. It becomes more intensified particularly over the summer when the sea is calmer, the channel's calmer. We were experiencing prior to the Home Office placing refugees in local hotels, we were locally we were beginning to see a decline in the number of presentations. That was linked to COVID. Our ports were closed, for example, travel was restricted. But that's actually changed quite dramatically since those restrictions have opened up. And as I said, particularly since the Home Office has identified our local hotels as places that can temporarily accommodate refugees, we are seeing an increase in presentations.
Last one. You finished? Okay, just to wrap up, I have one question. I'd like to pick up on the point of falling rules in RBKC, and for the record, I'm a governor at a school in that situation. What's the strategy for addressing this and making sure that schools are able to continue to discharge their statutory duties, and we spoke about SEND earlier as well, while suffering from the shortfalls in their budgets caused by falling rules?
Thank you, Chairman. So, as you know, the Schools Forum produced the ISOS report, which lists a variety of mechanisms and recommendations in order to address the challenge of falling roll numbers in the borough. And there are many different mechanisms of that, like some schools going down to one form entry, looking at different mechanisms for admissions, etc. But I'll hand over to Ian, who will be able to explain in much more detail about the specifics we're working on.
Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Randall. I think we've done some really good work in this area, particularly through the review that Councillor Randall refers to, the ISOS partnership review. And we've done some detailed work as a working group, and also more generally at Schools Forum, to think about our overall strategy. It's correct to say that in Kensington, Chelsea and across London, primary numbers are going down. There's a particular context to the start of the academic year this year, with some unknown factors in relation to post-lockdown, families returning, the context of Brexit as well. However, we are projecting 15% spare capacity across all year groups in primary school. The Department for Education would recommend that you keep between about 5 and 10% spare capacity to deal with in-year mobility, and precisely the context we've just spoken about in the previous discussion. The recommendation from ISOS that was accepted by Schools Forum is that we seek to reduce the overall number of primary places on offer by either 30 or 60 places, and we've already got a proposal from one school in the north that's been agreed to, as Councillor Reynolds says, reduce the number of places they offer from 60 to 30. So in terms of that recommendation, we're part of the way there, but it would be really helpful, I think, to see the census data this October, which will then, I think, be shared with us and at Schools Forum probably around December time, to see if even more action needs to be taken depending on the number of spare places. What I would say is that we've got some really good examples across the borough of schools working well together, perhaps whether they're sharing staffing, sharing a head teacher, there may be shared governing bodies, and so those schools are able to look at using their resources in the best way to maintain the outstanding quality of the education that's provided. There are no one form entry schools, so 30 place a year schools, that have a particular cause for concern currently with regard to spare places, and I have to say, that's not the case in the other borough I work for, in Westminster, or in other boroughs across London. So I think we are in a good position to have grasped nettle early on, be alive to some of those challenges, and also, as you say, be aware of the financial challenges that schools are facing. We've only got 2 schools currently in deficit. One school, by making that change, by reducing its number of places on offer, has actually come out of deficit, and I hope that schools feel our finance team is working more closely with schools and at an earlier stage to help them plan strategically, develop that 3-year budget plan, and that is reported back up to Schools Forum as well. And at the same time, I suppose a bright spot would be that we are working hard with schools to help maximise pupil numbers. So in this borough, many parents choose the independent sector, and that's absolutely their choice. However, we have seen over the past 5 years that the number of parents taking up an independent school place has gone down, and actually the numbers taking up state school provision has gone up. And to my mind, that's quite right. We have 67% of schools judged to be outstanding by Ofsted. Nationally, that figure is nearer 20%. So I think there's a role for all of us to promote the outstanding quality of our state schools so that parents can help make an informed decision.
Thank you, Ian. Thank you. There are no further questions. Thank you, Ian, very much for that discussion. It seems that the issue of Afghan refugees, of course, is of particular interest, so I'm sure the lead member will update us at the next meeting as well, no doubt. Okay, on to item A6, which is the lead member's response to the recommendations on education support provided by the Council to pupils affected by the Grenfell tragedy. In June this year, our committee reported and presented recommendations to the lead member on the education support provided by the Council to children and young people affected by the tragedy, and this report, A5, is now the lead member's formal response to those recommendations. Thank you, Councillor Rendell, for that response. Would you like to make any comments before we go into questions?
No, Chairman. I'd just like to thank the committee for their recommendations. Of course, they're listed in the report. I'm happy to go through them individually if people want that. I'm very much in your hands, and take any questions on those.
Colleagues, questions? Amanda?
Yes, I have one question, if I may, please. On point 8, you talked about having accepted the recommendation, significant progress having been made, and that you'd been in close correspondence with the chairs of governors and head teachers of Grenfell affected schools. And I wanted to know which schools those were.
Yes, thank you. So there are, as you would see from that, there were a variety of schools that I and the leader had a meeting with, and I wrote to those schools to follow up on some of those particular questions that they raised. They were St Francis, Thomas Jones, St Clement's and St James, yes, Avondale, and Oxford Gardens. Thank you, Ian. Yes, they were the head teachers and governors I spoke to during this particular meeting. The questions were initially raised about access to funding, especially for children and young people, since the Grenfell tragedy occurred, and how they could access that. We spoke through the Grenfell Education Fund and the steering group. We spoke through some of the budgetary challenges those schools are facing, as I mentioned earlier, due to the falling roll numbers. We talked about the £1 million that the council gave those all schools, I should say, in the borough over the COVID period in order to help their finances. I'm also pleased that the Department for Education also came to the party after intense lobbying from us in order to provide extra funding to those schools as well. So personally, I'm very pleased with what we've achieved so far. I think opening these conversations, having those conversations and being challenged by those schools was good, and it allowed us to defend them in terms of our conversation with the Department of Education and etc. in order to get those proper funding in place for this year.
May I ask why you didn't have any conversations with the secondary sector?
The secondary sector never approached us for any terms of challenge in terms of budgets, although I have visited our secondary schools in RBKC, so I've been to the KA, Chelsea Academy, All Saints, and had extensive conversations with those head teachers, talked about obviously challenges they're facing with Grenfell children, and in particular cases, of course, which we won't go into this meeting, and talked about the services that the council can provide them as well in order to help them as much as possible. But it was very much the primary schools who approached us as a grouping in order for us to have these conversations. Yes, you've got to.
Just to add a point there that, as is stated in the report, the Grenfell Education Fund steering group has been in place since a month after the tragedy, and that is a cross-phase group. We have really strong support and engagement from our secondary schools, including All Saints and Kensington Aldridge Academy on that group, for instance, and they do submit bids to the Grenfell Education Fund for support for both the bereaved and survivor cohorts and the wider cohort of children and people affected by the tragedy. And we continue to welcome applications to the fund from the, across the phases of education locally.
No, the only reason I brought this topic up is I should declare myself here as the Chairman of the Board of Governors at All Saints, and we didn't receive an invitation to this meeting and didn't know anything about it, so I was just surprised about that this meeting, what seemed quite a high-level meeting with the leader of the council and the member.
I'm very happy to welcome secondary schools to such a meeting if they would like one. I'm always willing and able to speak with all our amazing secondary heads. As I said, this was very much a effort from primary schools, especially those in North Kensington, who approached us directly. So as Ian mentioned, there was about 5 or 6 schools that approached us as a joint letter to have this meeting, and we followed up with this meeting and subsequent letter with those schools who had approached us.
That's interesting. The only point that I would make is the way it's phrased here. It sounds very much as if it's the lead members' initiative rather than in response to serious lobbying from primary schools, if you see what I mean. So it's interesting to have that clarification.
Yes, I do get that point. I'm happy to, amend that. But also, I must say that, through our work through the Grenfell Education Fund, that is very much led by the council and those people who sit on that committee. I'm one of those, Ian is as well, for the Grenfell Education Fund. So we have done that as well in terms of that. But I do get your point, Amanda, yes. Thank you.
And if I could just maybe add really quickly that we had a really helpful and extended discussion about Grenfell Sport at a previous select committee early this year, and those 5 head teachers and chairs of governors kindly gave their time to be part of that discussion. So I think that provides a bit of the context to that discussion and then the subsequent letter that was received by the council.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Any other questions? No? No. Okay, I have 2 questions. One on point 8. There's a point here about you, Councillor Renzo, you're working to ensure that the Grenfell Education Fund can continue with resources until 2024. I just wanted to double check whether, is that something that's new? Is that something that's currently sort of in doubt, I guess, that there will be funding in place until 2024?
Yes.
What expectations can we have?
So with that, the Grenfell Education Fund is, and Ian can correct me, but it's a year-on-year budget, both funded by RBKC and in part by the DFE. What we're aiming to do here is to look at the Grenfell Education Fund that can run in conjunction with our recovery programme, of which runs until 2024, and that's from the £50 million that the council committed to do that. As this committee may recall, the leadership team in July passed some budget for that, especially emotional health and wellbeing support, after which obviously this committee fed back on earlier this year as well. So it's very much looking at to run those things together in parallel in order to ensure that the community knows where we stand. And as I say in the report, I'm working with Councillor Wheel to look into that at this point.
Thank you. And my next one is about the North Kensington Inclusion Pilot. I think we would appreciate maybe some more information about what that will be.
Yes. So this is putting into practice the inclusion strategy, of which I referenced earlier, which is an overall strategy looking at to reduce our school exclusions. As I mentioned, that Kensington Chelsea has quite high school exclusions, and we're working with the schools. As I said, one of my priorities is to reduce those, to look at different ways that we can not exclude children, perhaps as a first line of resort. So the North Kensington Inclusion Pilot is a practical way in order to address that strategy. And we're working with schools in North Kensington. Ian can double check. We can double check with Ian those particular schools in order to look at those to bring those figures down. Basically, and we're working with schools directly, head teachers, and obviously messaging with parents as well in order to say how we can achieve this particular aim. There has been budget allocated, I think about £500,000 as a first go, to look at what we can do in order to work with council officers, etc., in order to do that, in order to bring that school exclusions down. But again, it's a pilot initially, so we're looking at initial phases and see how it works, and that will come back to the council, come back to me, just to see what we can do if there needs any amendment for that, but I'll let Ian fill in further detail.
I think it's worth saying that we've been really pleased with the openness in which schools have responded with regards to discussions that have been led by our Natasha Bishop, our Head of Early Help, working with the dedicated service and also with the education team. And we now have a number of early help workers co-located in secondary schools, doing some of that early intervention work, supporting and training staff to build capacity and helping them to identify at a very early stage some of those young people who may be at risk of exclusion, and particularly looking at young people who've just gone through transition to secondary, moved from a small primary school, working predominantly with 1 year 6 teacher to now learning with maybe a dozen different teachers and thinking about how that work might be most effective. We had some really good early evidence actually of the impact of that work in a kind of pre-version of the pilot at Chelsea Academy down in the south, and building on that across the north and for schools that we've identified where historically, and again our data is slightly skewed, but pre-lockdown, where there were high fixed terms, so temporary exclusion rates or permanent exclusion rates in primary or secondary, and all of those schools, they've not been defensive, they've really been up for that discussion, as I say, early days with the co-location of those staff. It's also worth saying that the pilot is very much minded to be working with community and voluntary organisations, and also supporting parents with advocacy and understanding a school's behaviour policy and exclusion policy, and so to give parents more of a voice in working with the schools, which the schools have said they would welcome as well.
Thank you. Further questions? No? Okay. Well, thanks very much for that, Councillor Renzel, Ian, Glenn. There's obviously quite a lot in the recommendations that are a work in progress, really lots of different publications that are referred to, so I'm sure we will come back to ask for a progress update at some point in the future. Thank you very much. Okay, on to item A7, which is a review of the Select Committee's work programme for 21-22. And this report sets out the committee's work programme for 21-22, and it lists all of the items at each of the Select Committee meetings coming up, various scrutiny activities that we're going to be doing outside of committee, the different methods that we're using to carry out the work, and the kind of support available to members as well to help us scrutinise these topics in depth. So as you can see in the report, the areas we have shortlisted from a long list of recommendations, we narrowed down the work programme to 3 areas, which are special educational needs provision in the borough, and we've been looking at that today, serious youth violence, and for that we are going to be convening a special dedicated meeting in February, I believe, and there will be a steering group led by myself and Amanda Sayers, who will be organising that meeting. And we will also be looking at children's safeguarding and Grenfell recovery as well. And the timeline that we're proposing for all of these topics is appended to the report. Tonight we're being asked to agree this work programme. Do members have any comments or questions? If not, we can take the work programme as agreed. Thank you very much. Is there any other urgent business? No? And we have not been notified of any urgent matters either. And that concludes the meeting of this evening's Family Services Select Committee. Thank you everyone for your time and for attending. Good evening.